being here and to all of you for coming out tonight as well. Um, I've known Eugene for almost 20 years. As I said last night, it's a little odd to formally introduce somebody that like we were at a writers conference together. That's where we met, and we called it the digs that we were in were pretty skanky. And we called it, he reminded me that we called it the Garage Mahal. This was not my name for it. But now we are fancy people wearing suits and scarves and stuff. It's funny how life works out like that in writing. In Miss Me Forever, Eugene Garcia-Cross's new novel, we meet Tulsi Gurung, a teenage Nepalese refugee who has just immigrated to the United States and been resettled near Erie, Pennsylvania, which is near where Eugene is from. Tulsi has a sister, Susmita, whom he has had to leave behind. Miss Me Forever is about the leavings and absences and erasures and explosions that put the long in longing. It's telling that the novel starts with a literal bang. I won't read the beginning because I think that's what Eugene's going to do. Tulsi Garcia-Cross writes in one section, quote, does not know the proper way to say goodbye, does not have the words. This is from a part where Tulsi literally flees a friend rather than say goodbye to them, moving, quote, deeper into the darkness, brushing past trees on either side, the headlights dying out among them. All he has to do is keep moving past the pain and fatigue. Somewhere the woods will end and the world begin. Eugene Garcia-Cross is the author of a previous collection of short stories, Fires of Our Choosing, also from Zank Books. He lives in LA, where he works as a screenwriter and story editor. His short fiction has been published in really terrific magazines, including Narrative, McSweeney's. That McSweeney's piece is really hilarious, by the way. Glimmer Train, Story Quarterly, and American Short Fiction. His writing is vivid and lush, believing in the beautiful, even as the world of his stories is not washed clean of violence and lewdness. In Miss Me Forever, Garcia-Cross shows us that we are not just the work we do, the places we've been, the subjects we study, but also that we are what we long for and what we miss. Please welcome Eugene Garcia-Cross back to the podium.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. That was so nice of you, and thank you all for coming out. It was so eloquent. I'm like, can I get that as a book review? Can you guys hear me okay? All right. Yeah, I just wanted to start by thanking the Rose O'Neill Literary House, everybody here at Washington College for welcoming me. James, Roy, Amber, Linda, all of you have been amazing, and it's just been a great couple days. I'm sad that it's coming to a close here. So I'm going to read from the beginning of the novel. I'm going to put my timer on so I don't, go past 3 hours. That was my limit. James told me I have a hard out. Yeah, the book follows Tulsi as he sort of, finds his way in his new home and also finds his way coping with the loss of his sister, who he's searching for, and his grief over his separation from her. And he doesn't want to give up looking for her. So that is sort of the central narrative drive of the novel. And the novel's also punctuated by letters that Susmita is writing to him. So I thought I might open with one of those and close with one as well. So, all right. Miss Me Forever. Dear brother, how do I say what is in my heart? How do I tell you those things now clouded by distance? I have known you in your earliest hour. I have watched you come into the world. Brother, you are gone from me. For the first time, your life is parted from my own. Who shall I watch over? Who shall I protect if not you? You were the smallest baby any elder in our camp had ever seen live. A miracle, they said, a nub of a child swaddled and hidden at our mother's breast. There were times I thought you did not exist, so small I could not see you among your blankets or slung against our mother's back. How is it that something I once scarcely believed was real has left such an absence? A void I feel more urgently than my own beating heart. Brother, I have wanted the world for you. and it is the world that has taken you from me. Susmita. October 2008. Tulsi is dreaming of oceans when he hears the explosion, a thundering boom that rattles the casement windows of his grandfather's apartment. For a moment, he is back in Nepal, in Camp Goldhap, the bamboo walls of his sister's hut casting a ladder of light across the packed earth floor. When he opens his eyes, he sees his grandfather at the front door, waving the broom he uses to clean the stoop. "Poor boys," he yells through the screen. "Poor boys." It is the night before Halloween, Tulsi's first holiday in the United States. It is a festival he does not yet completely understand. From what he has gathered, it involves human skeletons, candy, and the decoration of giant gourds, which are then blown up by the neighborhood boys for sport. Twice this week, Tulsi has heard the explosions and peered out the window to view the orange carnage in the street. Once, while dozing on the pullout that serves as his bed, he was awakened by the splatter of an egg against the window. Tulsi does not like Halloween and will be happy when it is past. Tulsi hurries across the apartment, his sandals slapping the plank flooring. He steps beside his grandfather and takes the broom from him. A piece of stringy pulp sticks in the screen. "Bad boys, Hajurba," Tulsi says as he places his hands on his grandfather's bony shoulders and guides him to his chair. "Here they are named bad boys." "Poor in spirit," his grandfather says. He lowers his wiry frame into the tattered lazy boy and with a sudden yank lifts his bare feet into the air. Their soles are the deep red-brown of mahogany and just as hard. "You must not be like them," he says, closing his eyes. "You are Nepali. Always remember this." Tulsi hears the boys laughing, their expensive sneakers pounding the sidewalk as they run away, and he thinks, it is impossible not to remember. Tulsi arrived in the United States 2 months ago, on an afternoon so impossibly damp and gray he wondered if he'd landed on the underside of the world. 3 days after leaving the transit center in Kathmandu, sleeping on planes and buses and in airport terminals, Tulsi picked his bag off a rotating conveyor belt that slid past his feet like a long steel snake. Outside the airport, a husky man with spiked blonde hair held a cardboard sign that read Tulsa. A black headset hung from one ear, and he appeared to be talking to himself. When he saw Tulsi staring at the sign, he touched something on the cellular phone attached to his belt and extended his hand. He pulled Tulsi into a half embrace until their shoulders met. "You've come a long way, brother," he said, "but your journey is only beginning." Tulsi was not quite sure what the man meant. He was clean-shaven, with features like a baby's, soft and rounded. His chin protruded only slightly farther than the roll of fat at his neck. He took Tulsi's bag and introduced himself as Pastor Ken, a youth pastor and volunteer for the International Institute. "Call me PK," he said. "That's my nickname. Do you have nicknames in Nepal? We'll get you one pronto," he said and smiled. On the ride to Tulsi's grandfather's apartment, the man spoke endlessly, describing the high school where Tulsi would be enrolled as a sophomore, the area of town where Tulsi's grandfather had just recently been relocated, the amount of rain they'd had that summer, and a list of other topics Tulsi only partly understood. Tulsi kept his eyes trained on the world unfolding around him. 4-lane highways divided by concrete slabs, rows of brick factories and warehouses that seemed completely empty, vehicles the size of boats with wheels that spun even when they stood still. He wished his sister Susmita were with him. She would be able to explain this place, to help him understand. She had remained in Goldhap, teaching at the one-room school where Tulsi himself had been a student. That spring, she had married another teacher, a kind man named Purna, who was so quiet you had to lean toward him when he spoke, as though his voice held magnetic properties. Tulsi had lived with them until his grandfather was settled in Pennsylvania, a place Tulsi's friends has assured him was governed by vampires. Purna's family would be relocated as well, and once they were, Susmita would travel with them as was their custom. Their new home could be anywhere: Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Tulsi knew it might be months before he heard from her, years before he saw her. He knew he might never see her again. The Tuesday after Halloween, Tulsi takes the bus to Pastor Ken's church, a huge white building with a giant cross on the side and the biggest parking lot he's ever seen. Inside is a chapel, gymnasium, full kitchen, nursery, and a dozen classrooms. By the time Tulsi finds the one where the ESL class is being held, many of the students are already seated with notebooks spread open before them. Most are dressed in jeans and sweatshirts. Tulsi was unsure what to wear for a class being held in a church, and so he has on khakis, beige socks beneath his leather sandals, a white dress shirt, and a tie that his grandfather bought him. The tie is pale blue. Stitched onto the front is a giant whale swimming vertically toward Tulsi's face, mouth spread open as though to devour him. Pastor Ken spots Tulsi from across the room and jogs over. "Oklahoma," he says, placing a meaty hand on Tulsi's shoulder. "We'll call you Oklahoma. You know, because I thought your name was Tulsa. But it's not." Tulsi nods uncertainly. While they're speaking, a slender woman in jeans and a t-shirt appears. Tulsi is suddenly very aware of the whale on his tie and crosses his arms over his chest to hide it. "You must be Tulsi," the woman says. "She has the blondest hair he has ever seen. Her eyes are the color of copper. I'm Abigail, Pastor Ken's wife. I'm here to help out as a conversation partner." Tulsi shakes her hand while keeping one arm crossed over his chest. "How's Oklahoma?" Pastor Ken asks his wife, wrapping an arm around her waist. "We're trying to figure out a nickname." Abigail smiles politely as though she's meeting the man standing beside her for the first time. "A bit long. Nicknames are supposed to be easy. But it's because I thought his name was Tulsa." Abigail pats her husband's hand where it holds her. "We'll give it some thought," she says. Pastor Ken opens the ESL class with a prayer. Through a sort of miming routine, he instructs everyone on the correct posture. Hands clasped, heads bent, eyes closed. Partway through, Tulsi peeks around the classroom. The other students have followed Pastor Ken's instructions with the sort of fervor that they all feel is necessary to fit in. Their hands are folded and outstretched before them. Their heads appear glued to their desks. Pastor Ken's eyes are squeezed shut, and a strained expression covers his face as though he's lifting a heavy object. He is saying something about trial and sacrifice. Across the room, Tulsi sees Abigail watching her husband, looking serious. She is the only one beside himself who does not have their eyes shut. Before Tulsi can put his head back down, Abigail turns and locks eyes with him. For a moment, he worries he's in trouble, but then she smiles. The class is taught by Dr. Malak, a local professor who is also a member of the church. A tall man with a long gray ponytail, he conjugates verbs on a dry erase board and makes jokes that Tulsi does not understand. The Asian man next to him fills his notebook with furious scribbles, even when the professor is not speaking. Tulsi has not brought a notebook, and instead repeats in his mind over and over what Dr. Malak has listed on the board. "I am being, I have been, I will be." While he waits at the bus stop, Tulsi leafs through the free Bible each student received after class. He can hardly believe how thin the pages are, like the wings of an insect. Across the highway, a construction crew digs a trench beside the road. A yellow car shaped like a helmet pulls near to where Tulsi waits, and Abigail waves him over. "Ken meets with the youth group on Tuesday nights, but I'm headed home. Do you need a ride?" The air smells of burning leaves and diesel fuel. A dump truck beeps as it backs towards the trench. Abigail reaches over and pushes open the passenger door. "Come on," she says, glancing at his sandals. "Your feet must be freezing." A hymn plays on the radio, and for the first few minutes they listen silently. The sky is a metallic blue with dark clouds that crop up like distant mountains. Tulsi wants to make conversation, but it is hard to think of something to say. Before he can, Abigail says, "I like your tie." Tulsi had momentarily forgotten about the stupid whale tie and looks down to find it clearly visible between the nylon straps of his seatbelt. He cannot imagine why, out of all the ties in their new country, his grandfather chose this one. He almost didn't wear it, but there was his grandfather, smiling his partially toothless smile, holding the tie out in both hands like an offering. Tulsi does not think Abigail is being sarcastic, though sarcasm is something he has trouble detecting, especially female sarcasm, which is somehow subtler. "My grandfather buys it for me," he finally says. Abigail nods as though she knew this was the case. "Well, it's very nice. It reminds me of the story of Jonah." "I'm not familiar," Tulsi says, surprised to hear himself do so. Normally, when he doesn't know what people are talking about, he smiles, like at school when the boys in his class argue the finer points of ultimate fighting, referencing things like cage matches and grappling, submission holds and fish hooking, razor elbows and Brazilian jiu-jitsu. Tulsi wants to argue with them, wants to say he's seen some of the fights on late-night cable, but joining their conversation is like jumping on a moving train. Instead, he remains silent, listens to their words as they rumble past. Jonah and the whale, Abigail says. She reaches over and touches the Bible in Tulsi's lap. It's in there. I am looking before, he says, very small print. He makes a gesture with his thumb and forefinger like he's crushing a bug and instantly feels stupid. It's surprising me. Everything else in the United States is very big. Abigail laughs a deep laugh. I guess that's true, she says, and then her face goes serious. It must be a lot different here than in the camps. Do you miss Nepal? They are heading north along Peach Street. Below them, Lake Erie makes a second bluer horizon beneath the sky. Tulsi wants to explain the situation as best he can, wants to tell her how the Bhutanese government kicked out all the ethnic Nepalese long before he was born, how the refugee camp was the only home he's ever known. When he was very young, his mother died from infection, and then his father left. He wants to tell Abigail how his grandfather and Susmita raised him, how Susmita chose to stay behind, and now he only has his grandfather, who is getting older and older, dark spots appearing on his skin like the water stains on the ceiling of their apartment. He wants to tell her how his grandfather works the overnight shift at the juice plant, how tired he looks when he gets home, but how he still waits until Tulsi has finished his breakfast and left for school before he will sleep. Tulsi wants Abigail to know he'll never be able to repay his grandfather for this. Abigail's car rocks over a pothole. In the distance, the faint outline of the moon sits atop a ribbon of clouds. Somewhere on the other side of the world, Tulsi thinks Susmita is sleeping, her shiny black hair covering her pillow like spilled ink. Some things I miss, he says. That night, Tulsi lies awake on the pull-out. His grandfather was already gone when Abigail dropped him off, and the apartment feels emptier than it normally does. A street light shines through the yellowed blinds, throwing stripes across the bare walls. Somewhere, a siren blares, and a few blocks up, a freighter rumbles along the tracks above 14th Street. Before he shut off the light, Tulsi read the story of Jonah, how he disobeyed God and ran away from him, how the ship he escaped on was struck by a terrible storm. He read how, after casting lots to see who brought this misfortune upon them, Jonah asked to be thrown overboard into the angry sea. Lying on the mattress, Tulsi imagines himself sinking slowly through dark water, his limbs weightless. He imagines a whale, as big as a mountain, swallowing him whole, the great rush as he's sucked into the belly of the beast. He closes his eyes, sealing in the darkness of that place, feels the creature descending, swimming through deep oceans, until after 3 days it spews him onto a distant shore, far from the land he calls home. Wednesday is the first day of Tihar, and Mr. and Mrs. Bandari, an elderly Nepalese couple resettled nearby, come over to celebrate. Together they light small clay lamps and pray that good will always triumph over evil. Mrs. Bandari is kind and smiles at Tulsi. Her face so full of wrinkles, her features seem lost between them. Her husband ignores Tulsi altogether. He speaks to his grandfather about America as though it is another planet. I am not liking it here, he says. This place is not good for Nepali people. It is making them forget our home country and our values. He glances in Tulsi's direction, especially young Nepali, he adds. I try not to leave my home, ever. This is my first exit since Monday when we were required to meet with a worker from the resettlement committee. They are sitting at the kitchen table. It is covered with half-empty dishes, a plate heaped with roti, a pot of curried vegetables and another of spicy dal, bowls of fermented pickles and chutney, and sweets made of almonds, pistachios, and coconut. Tulsi can still taste the burn of the chutney and wets his lips to reignite it. At school, they served mashed potatoes, lukewarm spaghetti, chopped steak, and thick brown gravy. Food so bland, Tulsi eats it only to keep from fainting. And if there was a fire, Tulsi's grandfather asks Mr. Bandari, would you leave then? He nudges Tulsi below the table with his knee. Tulsi hides a smile, grateful to be the grandson of this man and not the one across the table. Mr. Bandari considers the question seriously. Yes, he finally says. If there was a fire, then I would leave. Sunday is Baitika, the final day of the festival. It is the day sisters bless their brothers and pray for their well-being. Every year, for as long as his memory permits, Tulsi recalls Susmita drawing a tika of rice paste on his forehead. Tulsi touching her feet as she prayed that he would live a long and happy life, free from the evils of this world. The night before, Tulsi slept with the phone cradled on his chest. All day he waits for the phone to ring, waits to hear his sister's voice as she asks these things for him once again. But the day drops from beneath him like a trap door, and his grandfather leaves for work, and the phone does not ring. Tulsi sits in the empty apartment and wonders who will bless him now. The next Tuesday, Tulsi is the first to arrive at the ESL class. He is wearing a hooded sweatshirt and jeans. He brings a notebook, half a dozen pens, a bottle of water, and a power bar. He finds a seat near the front of the class and arranges these items at even intervals before him like a shrine. When Pastor Ken says the opening prayer, Tulsi keeps his forehead pressed against the cool plastic of his desk. Tulsi listens to Dr. Malak intently, as though he were offering the key to happiness, for in a way, Tulsi thinks he is. 20 minutes into the class, Abigail arrives and takes the open seat beside him. Tulsi smiles at her. She has brought nothing but herself. Taking care to be as quiet as possible, Tulsi tears 3 sheets from his notebook. He places them on her desk along with a pen. The instructor makes a list of questions on the board and asks the students to find a conversation partner. They are to take turns interviewing one another. When Abigail asks him the first question on the list, his favorite food, Tulsi says, Philadelphia cheesesteak. Tulsi has never tried one, but he has seen them prepared and eaten on the Food Channel, and Philadelphia is the biggest city in his new state. Really, Abigail asks? I love those. Yes, Tulsi says, delicious. All around him, he hears his peers struggling with their responses, their thick accents filling the air like a toxic gas. You know, Abigail says, for how long you've been here, your English is very strong. I studied before leaving, Tulsi says, at Blooming Lotus English School in our camp. But there, we study British English. A look of recognition lights up Abigail's face. She puts her hands over her heart and pretends to swoon. That's it, she says. I thought I heard a bit of a British accent from you. I adore it. It's so official sounding. Tulsi's cheeks flush with heat. He picks up a pen, sets it down again. He is flattered and embarrassed. He knows it was meant as a compliment, but still, this is not why he has come to class. I want to sound American, Tulsi says, looking away. After class, Abigail offers Tulsi a ride home. He thanks her, but says he is planning on making a stop first and doesn't want to delay her. I'm in no rush, she says. Just tell me where we're headed. It's past 8, but the Walmart lot is filled, and they have to park next door at a giant Cineplex built to look like a castle. Inside Walmart, an elderly employee in a cowboy hat and suspenders greets them and pushes a cart toward Tulsi. Fluorescent light reflects off the waxy floor. They pass barrels brimming with discounted DVDs and display cases filled with MP3 players and cameras. There are pyramids of junk food and rack upon rack of clothing. The front left wheel on the cart jiggles incessantly, pulling Tulsi toward aisles he has no wish to enter. There's a vision center, a tire display, a wall of freezers, a lawn and garden department. Finally, they reach the shoe aisle. Tulsi lives at the corner of 11th and Ash. The kids on his block, they all wear Nike Air Yeezys and Reebok G units. He's taken the bus to the Mill Creek Mall and wandered through the Finish Line and Foot Locker, eyeing the wall displays, but all these sneakers are too expensive. Even if he had the money, Tulsi knows he would feel guilty buying a pair. After weeks of saving what his grandfather gives him for lunch, eating nothing but hot dogs, the cheapest thing in the cafeteria, and drinking only water, he has managed to scrape together $30, just enough for the newest pair of Champion C9s. He finds them in black, then searches for a pair of 8s. The closest he can find are 9.5s. He slips them on and laces them up. Better try them out, Abigail says. At the end of the aisle, a mother pushes her cart and yells at her lagging daughter to hurry up. Once they turn the corner and disappear, Tulsi and Abigail are the only two around. Tulsi drops into a sprinter stance and takes off, running up and down the aisle while Abigail watches and laughs her deep laugh. The sneakers feel like they're going to slip off at any moment, but Tulsi figures he can double up on socks. Better too big than too small. He can grow into them. Abigail leans over the edge of the empty cart, applauding. Well, she asks, how do they feel? Perfect, Tulsi says. He places them back in their box exactly as he found them and puts it in the cart. In the checkout line, Tulsi recognizes another student from the ESL class, a Middle Eastern man named Aban. He is holding a giant package of diapers, and when he sees Abigail and Tulsi, he steps out of line and walks back to them. "Hello, friends," he says, smiling. He has on a faded turtleneck beneath his coat, the collar frayed by his thick beard. "A good class tonight." He hefts the package of diapers. "I buy for my baby, only 3 weeks old." Abigail smiles politely and offers a quiet congratulations. "It is a wonderful surprise for me." He looks at Tulsi and asks, "You're a student?" It is almost their turn at the register, and people are already waiting. Tulsi wishes Abon would not have seen them. "Yes," he says, inching the cart forward, "at East High School." "Excellent. Maybe you become doctor or minister like PK. Abon's brow wrinkles, and for a moment he looks as though he might cry. He turns to Abigail and says, "Your husband is a wonderful man." Abigail nods. "He's very fond of you as well." Her voice sounds flat, distant. Tulsi thinks she's acting strangely and wonders if it's because they have been seen together in public, if this is somehow improper. Abon's face lights up. He clutches the diapers to his chest and nods toward them. "You have," he asks, "baby with PK?" The cashier is waiting for them to step up. Tulsi can feel the eyes of the other people in line. Impatience, he has learned, is something of a birthright in his new home. Abigail is silent. She reaches out and taps her fingers against the handle of the cart, as though checking for stability. She shakes her head. "No," she says. The car ride home is silent. Abigail grips the wheel like it's something alive she's trying to subdue. Tulsi holds the shoebox in his lap. The clerk did not offer him a bag. He listens to the wind as it sails over the hood. The road they are on cuts through a rising valley Tulsi has never seen before. They might be headed downtown where he lives, but he cannot be certain. He wants to check with Abigail, but something tells him he should keep quiet. A line of clouds floats past a bone-white moon, and in the distance below the rise of the road, Tulsi spots the oily black surface of a pond. Abigail is staring straight ahead, and suddenly she says, "Why did he have to ask that?" Her voice sounds different, and Tulsi feels the tiny hairs on the back of his neck prickle. A home for the elderly sits in the clearing above the road. It's built low and wide, and some of the windows are lit up like portholes on a ship. "What kind of a question's that?" Abigail says. Tulsi is unsure what to say, and so he says nothing. Abigail is still not looking at him, and he senses that she does not expect him to answer. The road descends into the valley where the shadows of trees have darkened the asphalt, and for a moment, Tulsi feels the sensation of being submerged. Abigail cranks down her window, and the car floods with a sudden rush of freezing air. The sound it makes deafening. Tulsi keeps his head lowered, his eyes trained on the lettering of the box, which seems even more unfamiliar to him now. After a moment, Abigail turns to him, surprised. It seems that he's sitting beside her. "I'm sorry," she says. "I'm sorry. It's been a long day, a long couple of days, and I'm very tired." Tulsi nods. Slowly, he's beginning to understand. Abigail offered him a kindness, and he made a mistake. He took too long at the store, and now it is late. "I'm sorry for this," he says, patting the box. "It is dark out, and I am keeping you." "No," Abigail says, "that's not it at all. I'm glad you found your shoes. I'm glad you like them." She pats his hand, and instantly Tulsi forgets the guilt he was just feeling. Abigail rolls her window back up and adjusts the heater so that it blows a steady stream of warm air. "If you're happy, I am too," she says. She turns to him and smiles. "You're happy, aren't you?" Tulsi pulls the shoebox closer, feels the warm air from the heater wash over him. Abigail is driving him home, and he trusts she knows the way. "Yes," he tells her, "I am happy." A few days later, Tulsi sees snow for the first time. Fat flakes descend from bulging clouds and cover cars and benches, the naked branches of trees. For 3 days, it does nothing but snow, and for 3 days, Tulsi watches. Giant yellow plows fight through the drifts, forming banks along the sides of roads, building tiny mountains at the edges of parking lots. Tulsi is afraid to go outside, afraid to touch it. The temperature continues to drop, and the snow glazes over with a thin coat of ice that sparkles like crushed glass. At night, his grandfather wraps shopping bags over his socks and sandals and ties them with twine. Tulsi watches him slip and stumble along the sidewalk on his way to work. Tulsi tells his grandfather he is sick and cannot attend school. Tuesday comes, and he skips the ESL class. He stays inside the apartment all day wrapped in a thick shawl Susmita made for him before he left. When he first arrived, it smelled like her, like cardamom and lavender. But now, when Tulsi holds the shawl to his face and inhales, he smells only the cold. He wonders if Purna's family has been issued their resettlement orders, if Susmita has left Nepal. He wonders if it is snowing where she is. On Thursday, there's a knock at the door. Tulsi walks across the room, the shawl draped over his shoulders like a cape. He opens to find Abigail standing in the snow. She's wearing a bright red winter coat, a yellow scarf, and a green knit cap. She reminds him of a rainbow. He wants to say so, but instead invites her in. "You weren't in class the other night," she says. "I was worried." She's holding a large brown package tied with string. "Are you sick?" Tulsi shrugs his shoulders, and the shawl slips from one, dangles to the floor. "It's beautiful," Abigail says, pointing at it. "My sister makes it for me," he says, surprised to hear the words come out of his mouth. This is the first time since arriving that he's spoken of Susmita to anyone but his grandfather. Abigail looks intrigued. "I didn't know you had a sister," she says. "What's her name?" "Susmita," he says. "I lived with her before I come here." "You must miss her very much," Abigail says. Tulsi lifts the shawl from the floor and begins to fold it. "She wanted me to come here," he says, "to live with our Hajurba." Tulsi points toward the bedroom. He is asleep. Lately, his grandfather has been picking up extra shifts, volunteering to fill in when other employees request off for the holidays. He arrives home exhausted, too tired even to eat. "I'm sure she thought it was for the best," Abigail says. Tulsi nods. He remembers how in the weeks leading up to his departure, Susmita would only speak to him in English. She wanted him to be prepared, to be ready for his new home. If he tried to engage with her in Nepali, she would cover her ears and hum. He remembers his frustration, trying to communicate at such an important time in a language not his own. "I brought this for you," Abigail says, handing him the package. Tulsi accepts it hesitantly. They sit across from each other at the kitchen table. Tulsi unties the string, taking care not to rip the brown wrapping paper. Inside is a navy blue winter coat and matching hat. Both feature the trademark Nike swoosh in stark white. Tulsi runs his fingertips over the cool nylon. "I wasn't sure if you had any winter clothes," Abigail says and smiles. "I know the weather here isn't quite the same." Tulsi touches the smooth fabric once more, then folds the wrapping paper over it. "I am sorry. I cannot accept," he says and slides the package across the table. Abigail looks confused. "You don't like it?" "I like it very much, but I cannot repay you." "You don't have to," Abigail says and pushes the package back toward Tulsi. "It's a gift." She smiles and motions toward it. "Take it. It's nothing." Tulsi sits quietly for a moment. He knows he shouldn't, but finally he lifts the package and holds it to his chest. "It is something," he says. All right. And then, "Dear brother, today in the market I thought I saw you. A young man passed me, head bent low, the way you sometimes held yours. He had your frame, brother. He moved with your exact gait. He disappeared around a row of stalls, and I followed, trying to overtake him so that I might turn and see my brother's face. He walked quickly as though late for an appointment. It was the busiest hour, when the merchants lower their prices and try to sell the last of their goods. Soon the crowd swallowed him, and I lost sight. Would you think me foolish, brother, if I told you I stood and wept right there, in full view of the vendors selling their fruits and spices, the mothers shopping for their families' meals? Would you chastise me for such an open display of pain? More foolish things are done every day. I wonder sometimes, had our road been easier, if I would miss you how I do, if our mother had lived, if our father had stayed. Senseless questions, I know, an alternate history. Still, brother, steel forged in the hottest fire is the hardest to break. Your sister." All right, I'll stop there. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Will you answer some questions?
Sure,
Right.
definitely.
Would you mind just reframe or rephrasing the question for the mic so
Yes.
people online, because we're streaming.
All right.
Anyone want to ask our guest anything? Not all at once, Natalie.
Thank you. I mean, it's a great question. So the question is, how did I pick the theme of immigration and sort of explore the emotions of the characters? Um, it's a great question. The literal answer, or what sort of directly led me to it, is that I back in 20 or probably 2008, I was living in my hometown of Erie, Pennsylvania, and Erie had taken a large number of refugees, and they were of this particular. They were this particular group. They're called the Lechonsa people. They were a group in Bhutan, living in the south of Bhutan, but they were of Nepali origin. And over the course of the 20th century, they were sort of ethnically cleansed and pushed out of Bhutan, where they had lived for many years, built the infrastructure, and they were forced out. And so they had nowhere to return, and where they returned to is where their ancestors were from. Where they were originally from was Nepal, but they were put in refugee camps. And so I proposed sort of a writing program, an ESL, but also a creative writing program to work with the refugees who were in our hometown. But what I found was that the majority of the refugees I were working with had been born in the refugee camp. So they had never been to the actual country that they had been exiled from. And what you'll find is, like, that's more and more common. There's refugee camps in Sudan that have hundreds, if not thousands at this point, of grandchildren who had been born in the refugee camps. So they have never been to the country they were exiled from. Their parents had never been to the country they were exiled from. It was their grandparents. And that's how long these refugee camps sort of exist for, which is, I mean, horrendous and horrific. And anyway, so they had come to Erie, where I was living, and I was working with them doing these workshops, but also trying to help them with their English. And they were an incredible group of people, so resilient, so joyous, never even a shadow of a complaint. They had been resettled in hard parts of the city. They were sent to tough schools, but they were so happy to be there, so eager, so joyous. But they had also been separated from people that meant a great deal to them, because when they were sort of accepted by the United States, they were also accepted by Australia, Canada, other countries. So they had friends, they had relatives who ended up in different places that they weren't there. And one of the exercises I gave in the creative writing class was write a letter to somebody that was close to you in the camps, who maybe didn't end up with you in Erie. Maybe they ended up with you in a different part of the country or another country altogether. And I vividly recall, I was talking about this to James, there was a student who was writing about a friend of his that he had spent his entire life with. He was probably 13 or 14, and he goes, I remember playing with you in the fields. I remember going to school with you. I remember sharing meals with you. I remember your family was my family was your family. And at the end of the letter, I knew that the intent of what he wanted to say was, never forget me. Don't ever forget me. I'll never forget you. But the language wasn't there, and what he wrote was, miss me forever, which is such like an indictment, not an indictment, but such like, it's just tragic in the sense that, like, that's somehow, what we do when we're separated from people that we love. And so that was really the kernel of it, that idea that somebody who was separated from a sister who meant the world to them because of whatever the circumstances were, and is put in a new country, a new place, and they lost their person, and how do you move on? And that's sort of what the book explores, is how do you move on without that person and build a new life, but don't feel like you're forsaking that person or betraying them by giving up a search, or by letting yourself, accept a new life. So anyway, that was the seed of it. Great question. Yeah. Oh, wow. This is also a great question. So what inspired me to become a writer? I was hoping to get drafted in the NFL, and it just wasn't in the cards. No. I mean, that was kind of what I would love to be. No. I wish that was the story, and it's not. It's way less cool. No. I was sort of adrift. I grew up in Western Pennsylvania. I went to the University of Pittsburgh, had no idea what I wanted to do. But my mom, who's from Puerto Rico, was an internist, and I thought, well, I love kids. Maybe I'll be a pediatrician. Totally ignoring the fact, of course, that science was my worst course in high school. I got straight C's across the board. And so by the time I got to Pitt, Bio 1, I barely walked in before they kicked me out and threw my book after me. And then as I was a sophomore, and I took an elective, and I think that's kind of like what happens to us sometimes is, like, you don't realize these passions until they're presented to you. My high school was very focused on math and science, and I understand the importance of those, but there wasn't a big focus on the arts. And so I took that class as an elective, Intro to Creative Writing, And I was so taken by the materials we were given to read. I think I'd mentioned, it was Yusef Komanyaka's poetry, it was Larry Brown's fiction, it was a great array of reading, and also just the idea of creating something on the page. And I had also loved stories my whole life because I love to read on my own, but I also loved movies, I loved TV. And so there was like no turning back after that. I mean, I remember that classroom. I remember the teacher was an MFA student. He was teaching the class to get credit towards his admission. Like, he didn't have to pay admission if he taught classes. I remember him walking in. Bill Kirshner had on these like motorcycle boots, and he was like, "We don't use cliche." And a girl in the class was like, "What's wrong with cliche?" And then they got into a big fight, and she left. And I was like, "This is awesome. This is way better than organic chemistry." And so I think I never looked. Well, I'd love to say I never looked back. I looked back a whole ton. I was like, is law school still an option? Because it can be hard sometimes. So, but it's worked out. So, great question. Yeah. 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 Oh, that's a great question. And also a great point is this idea that you can have nostalgia. I mean, you're totally right, and something I've never even thought of, which is that nostalgia is so often associated with your childhood home, your childhood bedroom, your school, your grandmother's home. But you can be nostalgic for a place. I think of that movie that came out. I mean, it's got to be 15 years ago now. Room, about the mother and the child who are abducted, and they're held in a room, and they finally, not spoil it for you, but they finally get out. I know, they get out of that room. But the fallout from that, the mother, there's a suicide attempt. The son doesn't know how to function in society, and you can have nostalgia for those places that were not at the time maybe where you wanted to be in the world, and that's difficult. I mean, trauma bonding and those things are real. The question of the imagery is that so I should repeat it one more time. I'm sorry. Yeah. 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 Thank you. Yeah. 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 Thank you. So great question. How am I writing the imagery of nostalgia in this? I think it's a wonderful question. I think sometimes when you miss something or want something or long for something deeply enough, you almost materialize and fabricate the elements of that in your life that are missing. And I think throughout the book, Tulsi's looking for that sort of pseudo sister. I mean, with Abigail in the beginning, the pastor's wife. It's almost like he's putting her in that place, and then throughout the book, he's searching for his sister in a world that she doesn't exist in. But there's a scene in the book where he says he walks the streets of Toronto, and he's kind of looking for her, knowing that she's not there, but hoping she'll materialize. And I think like that does end up having a sort of ghostly effect. It's like wanting something that the odds are stacked against you, but almost like a magical hope that it will appear. And the scene in the club as well, where he and a friend have sort of imbibed ecstasy, and he thinks he sees his sister, and it's almost a willing of seeing her in that moment because he's under the influence, versus like it's almost easier for him to imagine her then, versus being sober and being in reality, and having the sort of stark reality of the separation front and center. So that's a great question. I have to think about that more. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Yes, yes. Yeah. 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 So now it's a great question. So how sort of the role that setting plays in the book, and how that affects Tulsi's story. I'm glad you asked that. I set the story in Erie, Pennsylvania, which is sort of I always call it, we're the crown jewel of the Rust Belt, because we're sort of equidistant from, I mean, Buffalo, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and Detroit's not that far a stretch. So, we were just a great industrial town, and it was I grew up in the 80s. Erie was great, but it was already during that time, the factories, the manufacturing was already starting to move out. There was, we had Hammer Mill, a big paper manufacturer. We had GE, and so many of my friends' dads, that's where they worked. And then now there's pockets of the city that are beautiful. We have Presque Isle, we have Lake Erie. Lake Erie, I know it doesn't sound exactly like the Riviera, but to me as a child, but then there's also parts of the city that are just, industrial wasteland. I mean, just empty factories and empty, paper mills and empty presses, and it's tough, And for Tulsi, being raised in a refugee camp, I thought that had to be so starkly different for him, so intimidating in its own way, as well as the weather. Talking about him seeing snow for the first time, and how he would react to that, and how that might frighten him, and also is a reminder that the way he's seeing the world is how he's seeing it. But that up until now, everything he's lived, everything he's seen, he's been able to see it through the lens of his sister, to have her help him navigate his existence. And now, not only is he in a new place, not only is he in a place that's so radically different from anything he's ever known, but it's almost as if he's lost his interpreter, right? It's almost as if being in a foreign land and you're separated from the one person who can tell you what's being said and what's being done. So that was part of it for me. And then I spent a lot of time in Pittsburgh. And one of the things I noticed with this group was that they were so, I'm sorry, no, but they were so positive. They worked so hard, and they took different job routes. And one of them was, a lot of them would work at the casino in Erie, and then a casino in Pittsburgh. And so that becomes a part of the book, is him sort of finding employment and family in a place that you wouldn't normally think of that. So yeah, the settings, I wanted it to set it somewhere I was sort of familiar with. Yeah. Any others?
I know someone wanted to ask you if since you're a screenwriter, are you going to turn your book into a
Oh man.
screenplay?
Yeah, you know what? I would love to. I do comedy and not drama, and this is drama, but I thought maybe maybe I could send this to like my reps, my manager or something, and like, nobody reads in LA. Nobody reads. It's so unfortunate. But I will say this, the last show I'll say this. My boss on the last show I was working on is I love him. He's just kind of this like legend. He created Last Man Standing with Tim Allen. He wrote on Frasier. He wrote on 30 Rock. He wrote on Just Shoot Me, Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt. He has 5 Emmys. He's the best guy. And during the pandemic, he wrote a novel. And, so we were talking about that even when I interviewed for the job, and he goes, I wrote this novel. He goes, and I'm really excited about it. I said, that's great. And he goes, yeah, I sent it to my agent a year ago, and I still haven't heard anything. And I said, if that guy can't get read, I'm never going to get read. So it's tough out there. It's tough. The executives have a lot going on, so they like quick story beats. So maybe someday. All right. Well, thank you so much. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
So thank you all for you really are tall, man. Thank you all for coming out. Eugene will sign books in the library. There's food and drink. Please eat it or take it with you, because otherwise we'll throw it away, and that will be sad. But thank you again for coming tonight. Our next event is Joey Ciara on March 5th and 6th, or just March 6th, Courtney? 5th and 6th. All right. So please mark your calendars, and stay tuned for more information about that. Thank you again. Thank you.